It is the autumn of 1966, and in a quiet office in Austria, an electrical engineer named Walter Garn is going through a stack of black and white photographs from a temple in southern Egypt. He is not a historian. He is not searching for lost civilizations or hidden gods. He is simply looking at a set of images the way any engineer looks at a diagram, tracing lines, checking proportions, comparing shapes to things he already knows. And then his hand stops. One photograph shows a strange, elongated carving deep inside a stone chamber, a shape that curls, narrows, and rests on a base unlike anything he has seen in a religious relief before. For a moment, he forgets he is looking at a temple wall at all. What he sees looks almost exactly like a glass vacuum tube, the same kind of tube he has studied in electrical engineering textbooks. He sits with that photograph for a long time, turning a single question over in his mind. Could an image carved into solid stone more than 2,000 years ago actually resemble a piece of modern electrical equipment? He has no way of proving it that year, and neither does anyone else, but the question he asks in that quiet office in 1966 refuses to die. It travels through decades of debate, television documentaries, academic papers, heated arguments between engineers and Egyptologists, and finally, in 2025, it lands in front of an artificial intelligence system that has been asked to look at the same carving with fresh eyes. What that AI system found has reignited a controversy that has simmered for 60 years, and it has pulled millions of people back into one simple, unsettling question. What exactly is carved on the walls of the Dendera Temple? Before we get into what the AI found, it helps to sit for a moment with just how strange the situation really is. This is not a grainy, disputed photograph or a rumor passed around online with no clear source. The carving in question is real. It is physically located inside a well-documented, extensively studied temple in southern Egypt. And it has been photographed, measured, and argued over by professional Egyptologists and engineers alike for more than half a century. That is what makes this story so different from typical internet mysteries. It is not built on speculation about something no one can actually see. It is built on a real object that anyone can travel to and stand in front of. And the argument is not about whether the carving exists, but about what it actually means. When a modern AI system was finally given the chance to measure that object with mathematical precision, instead of relying purely on the human eye, the debate suddenly had a new kind of evidence to work with. Evidence that could either put the mystery to rest or make it far more difficult to dismiss. To understand why this single image has caused so much argument for so long, you have to actually stand in front of it, or at least picture it clearly. Deep inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, in a series of underground rooms that most tourists never even know exist, there is a relief carved into the stone that immediately looks different from anything else in the building. It shows a long, rounded, bulb-shaped form. Inside that form, a snake-like figure stretches from one end to the other, its body curving in a smooth, continuous line. Beneath the bulb shape sits a stand or pedestal, and next to it stands a pillar-like object that some viewers compare to a modern electrical insulator, the kind of ceramic part used to keep dangerous voltage away from a support structure. To an untrained eye scrolling through a photo of it for the first time, it does not look like an image of a god or a flower. It looks like a piece of machinery. And that first impression, that split second of visual shock, is exactly the reason this carving has never stopped generating controversy. Mainstream Egyptologists have a clear and confident answer to what this image shows, and it has almost nothing to do with electricity. According to them, the carving depicts a lotus flower from which a snake emerges, a scene rooted deeply in ancient Egyptian creation mythology. In that mythology, the lotus represents the very beginning of existence, the flower from which the sun and the whole of creation first emerged from the waters of chaos. The snake inside it symbolizes divine energy, transformation, and the life force that Egyptians associated with their gods. Viewed this way, the carving is not a machine at all. It is a deeply symbolic religious scene, consistent with the temple's overall purpose as a place of worship dedicated to the goddess Hathor. This explanation is not a guess. It is built on decades of study of Egyptian religious texts, comparisons with similar imagery found elsewhere in Egypt, and a broad understanding of the symbolic language ancient Egyptian priests used throughout their temples. And yet, even accepting all of that, the shape itself keeps pulling people back to the same uncomfortable question. If this really is only a flower and a snake, why does its outline map so closely onto the silhouette of a sealed glass tube with an internal filament and a base? Is that resemblance nothing more than coincidence? The kind of pattern matching the human brain does constantly, seeing faces in clouds and shapes and shadows? Or is there something else going on that mainstream explanations have not fully accounted for? To understand why this carving carries so much weight, it helps to understand where it actually sits, because the location itself is part of the mystery. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is widely regarded as one of the best preserved temple complexes in all of Egypt, And every year it draws thousands of visitors who come specifically to see its walls covered in dense, detailed carvings. But the temple standing today is really only the final layer of something much older. Construction of the current structure is believed to have begun around 300 BCE during the Ptolemaic period, the era after Alexander the Great's death, when his successors ruled Egypt and blended Greek and Egyptian traditions together. The complex itself sprawls across nearly 40,000 square meters, filled with vast courtyards, towering halls, dozens of smaller rooms, and a network of underground chambers hidden beneath the main structure. But inscriptions found throughout the temple point to something even older. Many of them suggest that this exact site was considered sacred long before the Ptolemaic builders ever arrived, with religious structures believed to date back to Egypt's Old Kingdom, one of the earliest and most formative periods of ancient Egyptian civilization. That means the carvings visible today were not created in a vacuum. They likely represent religious ideas, symbols, and stories that had already been passed down for centuries, layer after layer of belief compressed into stone by builders who were continuing a tradition rather than starting one from scratch. This detail matters enormously because it means the true age of the ideas represented in this carving could be far older than the temple walls themselves, stretching back into a period of Egyptian history that remains far less documented and far more mysterious. The Temple of Hathor itself was dedicated to a goddess associated with love, music, joy, and motherhood, and pilgrims traveled from across ancient Egypt to worship there, drawn by her reputation as one of the most beloved deities in the entire pantheon. Even now, the temple continues to draw historians, archaeologists, and curious travelers from around the world, largely because of how well its carvings and inscriptions have survived the passage of more than 2,000 years. That level of preservation is itself part of why the Dendera Light Bulb carving has become so widely discussed. Unlike so many ancient artifacts that have been worn away, damaged, or lost entirely, this particular image remains sharp and clear enough for modern researchers to study its exact proportions in detail, which is precisely what made a rigorous technical analysis possible in the first place. The real heart of the mystery, though, is not found anywhere in the temple's open courtyards or grand public halls. It is hidden beneath the building entirely, in 6 underground chambers that ordinary Egyptians were never permitted to enter. These were not simple storage rooms. Access was restricted to priests who had undergone specific religious initiation, and it is believed that the temple's most sacred ceremonial objects were kept safely inside these hidden spaces. Physically, the chambers feel completely different from the rest of the temple. The rooms are cramped, the passageways narrow and twisting, and almost no natural light penetrates this deep into the structure. Everything about their design suggests they were meant to be secretive, controlled, and reserved for a small, select group of people who understood exactly what was being shown to them. And this is where the puzzle deepens even further. The carvings on the temple's outer walls, the ones visible to ordinary worshippers, are relatively straightforward. They depict gods, goddesses, rituals, and stories meant to be read and understood by the general public. But the carvings hidden away in these underground chambers look noticeably more complex, more detailed, and frankly stranger. They give the impression of having been created for people with specialized knowledge, not casual worshippers passing through. And it is precisely inside these restricted, secretive chambers, not out on the public walls, that the so-called Dendera Light Bulb carving is found. If it were simply an ordinary religious symbol like countless others repeated throughout Egyptian temples, why would it be hidden away in one of the most restricted, secured spaces in the entire complex? That single fact, more than the shape of the carving itself, is what keeps serious researchers unwilling to dismiss the question outright. There is another layer to this mystery that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it has nothing to do with the carving's shape at all. It has to do with how these underground rooms were decorated in the first place. Modern visitors sometimes forget just how dark these chambers truly are. Almost no sunlight reaches this deep into the temple, a problem shared by many ancient Egyptian tombs and underground spaces. And yet the paintings and carvings on these walls remain remarkably crisp and detailed even today. So how exactly did ancient artists work with such precision in near total darkness? The standard explanation offered by most historians involves polished metal mirrors used to redirect sunlight deep into the temple's interior, supplemented by oil lamps, where mirrors alone were not enough. On the surface, this sounds perfectly reasonable. Mirrors made of polished bronze or copper were certainly available to the ancient Egyptians, and oil lamps were common lighting tools throughout the ancient world. But the deeper you go into the temple's narrowest, most twisting inner chambers, the harder this explanation becomes to fully accept. Sunlight redirected through multiple mirror bounces loses significant intensity with every reflection, and by the time it would have reached the deepest corners of these winding passageways, it likely would have been far too weak to allow for the kind of fine detail work visible on these walls. Oil lamps present their own problem. Burning oil lamps in small, sealed underground rooms for extended periods would gradually reduce oxygen levels, making prolonged work increasingly difficult. More importantly, Burning oil lamps produce soot, a black carbon residue that typically coats nearby ceilings and walls over time. Because of this, researchers have carried out carbon analysis on the ceilings of several of these chambers. And in multiple locations, they did not find the kind of soot buildup you would expect from lamps burning continuously during long working sessions. To be absolutely clear, this does not prove that some alternative lighting technology existed. It simply means the traditional explanation does not comfortably account for every chamber, and that gap has never been fully closed by mainstream archaeology. If the Dendera carving stood entirely alone, isolated with no comparable evidence anywhere else in the ancient world, it would likely have remained a minor curiosity, an interesting visual coincidence discussed occasionally and then forgotten. But it does not stand alone, and this is exactly why the debate refuses to fade away. In 1938, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig was working through a collection of artifacts excavated near Baghdad when he came across an unusual object that would later become known as the Baghdad Battery. It was a small clay jar, roughly 14 centimeters tall, that initially looked like nothing more than an ordinary ceramic container. On closer inspection, though, researchers found a copper cylinder fitted inside the jar, and at the center of that cylinder sat an iron rod. The entire assembly had been carefully sealed with asphalt, suggesting a deliberate, engineered construction rather than a random accident. Decades later, scientists built exact replicas of this object and filled them with mildly acidic liquids such as vinegar or grape juice, common substances that would have been readily available in the ancient world. When tested, these replicas produced roughly 1.1 volts of electricity. That is a tiny amount of power by modern standards, nowhere near enough to run anything resembling a light bulb, but it is more than enough to demonstrate that this design functions as a basic galvanic cell, the same fundamental principle behind every battery used today. Many researchers believe that if the Baghdad Battery was actually used for its apparent electrical function, the most likely application would have been electroplating, a process used to coat one metal with a thin layer of another using an electric current. There is still no full consensus on exactly how or why it was used, but the discovery permanently shifted the conversation. It was no longer purely a question of whether ancient civilizations had any concept of electricity at all. At minimum, it strongly suggested that some ancient societies understood basic electrochemical principles centuries before Alessandro Volta ever built the first modern battery in 1800. And once that possibility was on the table, the Dendera carving stopped looking like an isolated curiosity and started looking like part of a much larger, much stranger pattern. It is worth noting that the Baghdad Battery itself remains controversial among mainstream archaeologists. Some argue the jar was more likely used to store sacred scrolls, with the metal components serving a purely practical or ritual purpose unrelated to electricity. Others point out that no wires, connectors, or devices that could plausibly have been powered by such a battery have ever been found alongside it, which makes it difficult to say with confidence what the object was actually used for. Even so, the mere possibility that it functioned as a simple electrochemical cell was enough to change how many researchers approached other unexplained ancient artifacts, the Dendera carving included. Once one accepted anomaly enters the conversation, however contested, it becomes much harder to dismiss a second one purely on the grounds that ancient technology could not possibly have gone in that direction. For decades, this entire debate played out through the same limited toolkit, close visual comparison, engineering intuition, and heated argument, without any way to systematically test the similarities everyone kept noticing. That changed in 2025 when researchers turned to artificial intelligence to take a fresh, more rigorous pass at the evidence. This is where Grok AI enters the story. According to reports describing the analysis, the AI system was provided with an extensive academic dataset connected to the Dendera carving, including published research papers, high-resolution photographs, precise measurements, translations of the accompanying hieroglyphic text, and other technical documentation gathered over decades of study. The system was then tasked with examining the carving not purely as a piece of religious art, but as a possible technical design, a fundamentally different kind of analysis than traditional art history typically performs. Where an art historian focuses primarily on symbolic and cultural meaning, this kind of engineering style analysis instead focuses on measurable structure, comparing exact proportions, dimensions, and spatial relationships against known technical devices. To carry this out, researchers used photogrammetry data extracted from high-resolution photographs of the carving, essentially converting visual images into precise mathematical measurements. Those measurements were then systematically compared against the known design specifications of various vacuum tubes and Crookes tubes, the same type of sealed glass tube that first caught Walter Garn's attention back in 1966. Rather than simply asking whether the carving looked similar to a light bulb, the analysis measured specific quantities, the overall length and width of the bulb-shaped outline, the exact position of the snake-like figure within it, the proportions of the base structure, and the overall balance of the composition. According to the reported findings, several of these key proportional relationships matched corresponding measurements from working vacuum tube designs with a difference of less than 5%. On its own, a single close match might mean very little. But the analysis reportedly found multiple proportions clustering this closely together, and a statistical pattern across these repeated close matches, something the AI suggested was unlikely to occur purely by coincidence. It is critical to understand exactly what this claim does and does not mean. The AI never stated that it had found proof of ancient electricity, and it never claimed the carving is definitively a depiction of a light bulb. What it reportedly concluded was more careful and more limited than that. It found that certain technical proportions embedded in the carving's design are difficult to dismiss as simple artistic coincidence, and that these patterns deserve more serious, more rigorous scientific investigation than they have historically received. Alongside the measurements themselves, there's the matter of the hieroglyphic inscriptions carved directly beside the image, text that Egyptologists translated many years before this AI analysis ever took place. The most frequently cited phrase from this inscription is commonly translated along the lines of the Great One who gives light. At first glance, especially paired with a bulb-shaped carving, that phrase feels almost too perfectly literal, as though it were describing a lamp. But translation and interpretation are rarely that simple. The overwhelming mainstream reading connects this phrase to Ra, the Egyptian sun god, who was understood as the fundamental source of life, warmth, and light in Egyptian religious belief. Under this interpretation, the inscription is describing a divine, cosmic form of illumination tied to creation mythology, not a physical device sitting in a temple basement. That said, a smaller group of researchers points out that the same words could plausibly describe an object that produces literal light just as easily as they could describe a god associated with light symbolically. Language, especially language translated across thousands of years in a completely different worldview, rarely offers only one possible meaning. This ambiguity does not settle anything on its own, but it adds one more layer of genuine uncertainty to a debate that already had plenty. Translation of ancient languages is rarely a simple word-for-word process. Egyptian hieroglyphic texts often carry multiple layers of meaning at once, blending literal description with symbolic and religious significance in ways that modern readers can find genuinely difficult to separate. A phrase that sounds almost mechanical when translated into plain modern English may have carried a purely poetic or theological weight for the priests who originally carved it. This is exactly why serious researchers on both sides of the debate tend to treat the inscription as supporting evidence rather than a decisive answer on its own. It adds context, but it does not, by itself, prove either interpretation correct. So what precisely did this AI analysis actually establish? And just as importantly, what did it fail to establish? This distinction matters enormously because it is exactly where so much of the online conversation around this topic tends to go wrong. The AI did not claim, at any point, that the Dendera carving is definitively a depiction of a light bulb or any other electrical device. What it reportedly demonstrated is that the carving shares specific, measurable proportional similarities with the design of a functioning vacuum tube, similarities close enough in several instances to fall under a 5% margin of difference, which is considerably tighter than most people would expect from a purely coincidental visual resemblance. It also revisited the long-standing puzzle of the missing soot residue in several of the temple's darkest inner chambers, treating it as a genuinely open question rather than dismissing it outright, while explicitly noting that the absence of soot alone proves absolutely nothing about the presence of ancient electric lighting. It acknowledged the Baghdad Battery as meaningful supporting context, evidence that certain ancient societies plausibly understood basic electrochemical principles, while being careful to note that understanding a basic electrochemical reaction is an enormous leap away from constructing anything resembling a functioning vacuum tube or electric light. In other words, the analysis was noticeably restrained. It could not prove that ancient Egyptians possessed electrical technology. It could not prove that this specific carving represents a real device rather than a religious symbol. There remains no direct archaeological evidence, no physical component, no wiring, no power source ever discovered at Dendera itself that would transform this theory into an established fact. What the analysis did accomplish was something more modest but still genuinely significant. It took a question that mainstream academia had largely dismissed as fringe speculation and re-examined it, using precise measurements and structured technical comparison rather than pure conjecture. It did not close the case. If anything, it reopened it with a stronger, more organized foundation than the debate has ever had before. There is one more detail about this carving that surprisingly few casual observers ever learn, and it substantially changes how you should think about the entire mystery. The famous bulb-shaped image is not a single isolated carving somewhere in the temple. Researchers have identified at least 5 separate reliefs sharing this same overall design within the southern underground chambers of the complex. Looking closely across all 5, an interesting pattern emerges. The bulb-shaped outer form remains remarkably consistent from one carving to the next, but the snake-like figure inside is not always positioned identically, sometimes appearing slightly further forward, sometimes slightly further back. At first glance, this might just look like normal artistic variation, the kind of small stylistic differences you would expect from different carvers working across different periods. But when researchers actually compared the underlying measurements and proportions of all 5 reliefs, the core structure turned out to be almost identical across every single one. The outer bulb shape, the base beneath it, and the overall compositional balance all matched closely across multiple independent carvings. This raises 2 genuinely competing interpretations. If this is fundamentally a religious scene, then minor variations between individual depictions are completely unremarkable and expected, the same way religious art across any culture shows natural stylistic drift over time. But if the same precise structural design is being repeated again and again with such consistent proportions, some researchers argue that this level of consistency could also point towards something closer to a fixed template or blueprint, the kind of repeated precision you would expect from a design meant to represent a specific object or function, rather than a purely symbolic scene open to artistic interpretation. To be clear, this repetition alone does not prove these carvings depict actual machinery. But it does mean the conversation is no longer just about one unusual image. It is about an entire consistent pattern repeated across a restricted, secretive space within one of Egypt's most important temples. And that broader pattern is genuinely harder to wave away than a single carving would be. Stepping back from all the individual pieces of evidence, it becomes clear that this debate essentially comes down to 2 fundamentally different ways of looking at the exact same image. Mainstream Egyptology reads the Dendera carving through the lens of religious symbolism, and there is real substance behind that reading. The lotus flower represents the origin of creation in Egyptian mythology, the moment when the sun and existence itself first emerged from primordial waters. The snake represents divine energy, transformation, and rebirth, themes that appear consistently throughout Egyptian religious art. Under this framework, the entire image fits comfortably and coherently within a well-documented, extensively studied belief system, and this interpretation has remained the dominant academic position for good reason. The alternative reading, sometimes referred to as the operational device theory, does not reject the religious framing outright, but suggests that the same image might also symbolically represent an object that performs a genuine physical function. An interpretation built not on mythology, but on measured proportions, repeated structural patterns across multiple carvings, and unresolved physical anomalies like the missing soot in certain chambers. Neither interpretation has been definitively proven, and it is worth being completely honest about that. The religious interpretation is backed by centuries of studied mythology, established translation work, and consistency with the temple's overall purpose. The technical interpretation is backed by precise measurements, engineering-style proportional analysis, and a set of physical questions that traditional explanations have never fully resolved. The most intellectually honest approach right now is to hold both possibilities seriously, to keep pushing for better evidence rather than certainty in either direction, and to resist the urge to declare a final winner before the physical proof actually exists to support one. So where does all of this actually leave us? This nearly 2,000-year-old carving remains one of the most persistently debated images in ancient archaeology, a single relief that has kept engineers, historians, and researchers arguing with each other for more than 60 years and counting. For some, it will always be exactly what mainstream Egyptology says it is, a beautiful and meaningful piece of religious symbolism connected to one of the oldest creation stories in human history. For others, it remains a genuine unresolved puzzle, a shape too precise, too proportionally consistent, and too strangely located to dismiss without deeper investigation. The 2025 AI analysis did not settle this argument once and for all, and it was never going to. What it did was bring a level of measurement and structured comparison to a debate that had spent decades running almost entirely on visual impression and gut instinct. It raised legitimate new questions about proportional matching, about the strange absence of soot in certain chambers, and about the consistency seen across 5 separate carvings, while being careful never to claim more certainty than the actual evidence supports. No solid physical proof has been found that ancient Egypt possessed working electrical technology, and that fact has not changed. But the questions surrounding this carving are clearly not going away either. Future advances in 3-dimensional scanning, more sophisticated AI-driven analysis, and potential new archaeological discoveries at Dendera or comparable sites could eventually push this debate toward a genuine resolution in one direction or the other. For now, though, the Dendera carving remains exactly what it has been for 60 years, one of history's most stubborn, most fascinating unanswered questions, hidden in the dark chambers of an ancient temple, waiting for someone, or something, to finally prove what it really represents. Whatever the truth eventually turns out to be, one thing is already certain. A single carving on a temple wall in Egypt has managed to keep engineers, priests of history, and now artificial intelligence itself arguing across generations, and that alone makes it one of the most remarkable images the ancient world ever left behind.